So we're going to be going over the 6 different cases of simplifying a radical in Algebra 2 when you're solving a quadratic equation. Here is the first case. In all the cases, we're going to check these 3 questions on the left side. The first case is if it's something like this where it's just a perfect square. We're still going to check, is it negative? This one is not negative, so no. The second thing we'll check is it a perfect square? Yes, it is. So we don't have to do the last question. Since it's already a perfect square, we just square root it. The square root of 16 is 4. The second case is something like this, where we have the square root of negative 25. The first thing we want to check is the number negative? And since it is negative, what we're going to do is we are going to separate it into negative 1 times 25. The second thing is it a perfect square? Yes, the number we have left over is indeed a perfect square, so we don't have to break it apart further, which means we don't have to check the third question. And now we just square root each of the bases, or each of the factors. So we're going to have the square root of negative 1, which is I, and the square root of 25, which is 5. In this case, for case 3, we are going to do the same thing. Check to see if it's negative. It is not. We're going to check to see if it's a perfect square. Unfortunately, 32 is not a perfect square. So this is a case where it's not a perfect square, so we're going to check the third question here. What is the biggest perfect square that goes into 32? Sometimes this is a little bit of guess and check, but the biggest perfect square that goes into 32 is 16. So we're going to rewrite it as 16 times 2. And then just take the square root of each of those factors, which gives us 4 square roots of 2. Okay, in the next case, we have the square root of negative 24. As we go through and check things, the first thing we check is to see if it's negative, and it is negative. So we'll separate into the square root of negative 1 times something. Now, in this case, I'm going to hold off on writing it because the next question, is it a perfect square? Well, no, 24 is not a perfect square. So we're going to have to continue to break down the 24. So what is the biggest perfect square that goes into 24? The biggest perfect square that goes into 24, I believe, is 4. So we can rewrite it as 4 times 6. So we just want to separate it and take the square root of each of those different factors. Square root of negative 1 is I, square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 6 we can't actually do, so we'd leave it as the square root of 6. Now case 5 here, going down through the same questions. Is it negative? No, it's not. Square root of 21 is not a perfect square. And if we check the third question, there is no perfect square that actually goes into 21 besides 1. And that's not very helpful. So we can't actually do anything to break down this radical, and that's fine, it happens. So the square root of 21 is just going to stay the square root of 21. And the last case that can happen is case 6 here. We're asked, is it negative? Yes, it is. So the first thing we're going to check off is breaking it apart into negative 1 times... well, is it a perfect square? 7 is not a perfect square, so we would try to break the number 7 up farther. Is there a perfect square that goes into 7? And the only perfect square that does go into 7 is 1, which is not very helpful. So we're going to just leave it as 7. Sometimes we can't break apart that number, and that is fine. Now we'll just square root each of the 2 factors that we actually have. Square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 7 we can't actually do anything with, so it will stay the square root of 7. And those are the 6 different cases that can happen when you're trying to simplify the radical when doing quadratic formula or completing the square in Algebra 2.